To be frank, the personal philosophy of Bertrand Russell's brother. This paper was first delivered to the BRS annual meeting on the 18th of June 2021. I was invited to submit an abstract for the meeting following the publication of my biography of Frank, Bertrand's brother, The Marriages, Morals and Misdemeanours of Frank, 2nd Earl Russell. I decided to talk to the conference about Frank's personal philosophy as I interpret it, thinking it might give a different perspective on a man more commonly known for his peccadilloes than his principles. And then just before the conference, a review of Bertrand's brother by Bill Bruno of the University of British Columbia was published in the Journal of Bertrand Russell Studies. In it, Bill raised the question of whether Frank, who always thought himself fundamentally an engineer, was not also in some ways a philosopher, whether it was not a little too easy to accept Frank's explanation of what he was beneath his skin, whether philosophical bones might not also lurk there. It seems I was not the only one to be thinking about Frank in this way. So this paper might be considered a prelude to any further analysis of the exact shape and density of any philosophical bones Frank might have possessed. It will look at how and where Frank chose to expend his energy and what we can learn of his philosophical outlook through his labours. Though unlike his younger brother, Frank was not a philosopher by profession, so far as any rational thinking person might be described as having a philosophy, Frank most certainly did. Clues as to his ethics are scattered throughout his diverse body of work, and he made several definite statements about himself, which I have drawn together here. In the preface to his 1902 lay sermons, he declared himself an agnostic. In a 1916 letter to the New Statesman, he described himself as a socialist and strong individualist. And in his autobiography, he stated that the only other life he might have envisaged for himself was one devoted to pure science. An individualist and a scientist, Frank may always have been, but his position on religion and socialism both changed over his lifetime, from stating a definite belief in Christianity as late as 1891 and denying any links whatsoever with socialism in 1892. It is my contention that he got from one position to the other through the application of a personal philosophy, which I have distilled to three basic tenets. That every person should think for him or herself. That reason should be applied to all accepted conventions to separate truth from dogma. That one should always retain a spirit of freedom and fidelity to one's ideals. These principles run like a red thread through all of Frank's public work and were, I think, instilled in him in childhood. Unlike Bertie, Frank had 10 years in the care and under the tutelage of one or both his parents before their early deaths, his mother in 1874, his father in 1876. These radical parents employed the philosophies of John Stuart Mill and Herbert Spencer and the educational policies of W.F. Collier and Friedrich Froebel in Frank's upbringing, allowing him vast freedom in thought and action in an atmosphere uninhibited by convention and entirely devoid of religious dogma. Frank was allowed to read whatever he liked, ask any question and expect a reasoned answer. He was encouraged as a small child to go barefoot, climb trees, and roam the countryside around their home with his little sister Rachel, completely unchaperoned when he was only 5 years old and she was only 3. He engaged in biological experiments with his tutor, Douglas Spaulding, from age 8, and spent an inordinate amount of time with his parents compared to most Victorian children. This unorthodox upbringing taught Frank to think for himself, but also made him willful, demanding, and often impossible to control. Still, he would publicly endorse it as an ideal upbringing in his 1902 lay sermons, both in advocating that children should have an intimate knowledge of their natural environment, and also in his assertion that there should be no limitations to their right of inquiry, no trammels to the free play of their minds, and no answer which consists of a mere assertion or a reference to somebody else's written creed can be considered satisfactory. This reference to someone else's written creed, of course, included that of the church, and I'll come on to that. but to continue with his early development. After his parents died in a difficult stay at his grandparents' house, Pembroke Lodge, Frank was sent to Cheam and then to Winchester College, where he found a lifelong spiritual home and in fact became very pious under the influence of Winchester and his particular friend there, Lionel Johnson. Then from that disciplined environment, he went to Oxford, where he absolutely relished the opposite, freedom, his first real taste of it since his childhood home. That summer, Frank's cousin St. George had introduced him to Buddhism, and at Oxford there were untrammeled and unfettered discussions on everything in heaven and earth, and a real sense of brotherhood. But in 1885, it all came crashing down. Frank was famously sent down from Oxford, supposedly for having written an immoral letter to another undergraduate, and after a couple of years of wild follies, embarked on a path that would lead him straight into the clutches of wife number one, Mabel Edith Scott. Frank's matrimonial affairs are a thoroughly entertaining tale that can be read about in my book, but for the purpose of this paper, suffice to say that being Frank's wife was not an easy job. He was demanding, pernickety, unbending, and often prey to unbridled tempers, a notoriously difficult man to live with. His first marriage was a complete disaster and led to a 10-year legal battle to extricate himself from it through the divorce court. The eagle-eyed amongst you will spot the overlap in the dates between wives number 1 and 2, when Frank, frustrated at the apparent stalemate in his marital affairs, took matters into his own hands and contracted a bigamous, yet in his eyes morally defensible marriage with Molly Somerville. Yet the law is the law, and Frank was made an example of. He was tried before his peers in the House of Lords, found guilty and imprisoned for 3 months. His early experiences did not affect his aspirations for marriage, which remained high. In fact, it is through these experiences that we see the emergence of an idealistic, principled man whose weaknesses as a husband became his strengths as a campaigner. He used the period of enforced seclusion in Holloway Prison to reread all of Shakespeare twice, refamiliarize himself with the Bible, and then, as he put it, to develop some ideas he had long held. The resultant lay sermons, published the following year, just as his brother was sitting down to write Free Man's Worship, give us the first clear expression of how Frank's experiences thus far shaped his moral outlook. In chapter 3, for example, Frank explored the institution of marriage and expressed the opinion that if the realization dawned on a husband or wife that they had not attained its ideal, it was their duty to confront it. In suggesting the situation of a wife finding her individuality lost under the protecting caress of her husband, he asked whether this was not the stifling of a full and true life, and whether she ought not to make a bid for freedom. Conversely, a husband finding his marriage had lost its passion, becoming one of mere companionship and habit, he asked whether that man might not be being false to the truest instincts of nature, killing the imperious God-given desire for the fullest life if he continued to live in such a way. Ironically, Frank's own later experience with wife number 3 might answer in the first instance, Bertie's with Alice in the second. The very existence of lay sermons also strongly suggests that Frank was using his confinement to consider and fully embody the role he would play on his release. A certain awareness of this comes through passages like this one, in which he states that along with country vicars and principled politicians, reformers receive the contemptuous tolerance accorded to visionaries, and on the career of one and all the word failure appears to be written, and ineffectual to be the only comment on their lives. But the harvest is not yet, and when after seed time the grain is lost to sight in the ground, no man can say how it may be germinating, what roots it is striking, or what the ultimate crop shall be. If this was indeed a critical moment in Frank's life, how do we view his achievements thereafter? Was he a failure, ineffectual, and what were his own aspirations? By way of obituary, E.S.P. Haynes wrote, I have met a great many lawyers in my time, but I have seldom come across anyone endowed with such penetrating intelligence and aptitude for seeing the essential point of a problem at a glance. He was talking specifically about divorce law reform, but Haynes also praised Frank's moral courage and unflinching audacity in everything he undertook, calling it his most impressive characteristic. It is possible, though by no means certain, that Haynes also wrote this on the occasion of Frank's 48th birthday, that Frank was the embodiment of strength and purpose. Once he has decided on a line of action, there is nothing can make him swerve from the path. Yet there is nothing of blind obstinacy in his determination. Every opinion, every phase of the situation to be fought is carefully and honestly considered in making up that mind. Furthermore, once a seed of thought had been sown, its growth was nurtured with broad unselfishness. So let's have a look at Frank as a worker in the vineyard and see what he achieved. Given his prior experiences, it was natural for Frank to start here, but audacious to make sweeping reform the subject of his first major speech in the House of Lords, delivered on the 1st of May 1902. Frank had concluded by then that the law was irrational and unjust. In the introduction to his book on the subject, published 10 years later, he wrote, "Many features of the present law, some merely quaint, others undesirable and oppressive, would never have been introduced by a sane politician or jurist into a code of divorce written on a blank page. They were a throwback to the days when ecclesiastical courts had jurisdiction. To Frank, marriage was a civil contract, and so quite simply should its remedy be when a marriage failed. As such, the law should not be subject to what he called ecclesiastical tyranny." Here we have the legal position at the time. Ecclesiastical influence is seen throughout, particularly in the grounds for divorce all being of a sexual nature and being different for men and women. For a full divorce, a wife needed to prove aggravated adultery, that is, adultery compounded by one of the lesser offences, usually cruelty or desertion. This was justified by the ridiculous notion that because the language of the Bible was masculine, there should be a different set of rules for women, compounded by the very difficult problem of the potential consequences for a husband of his wife's adultery, by which I mean, of course, illegitimate offspring. In such a manner, a husband's adultery was made somewhat excusable, though the law did recognise that there were certain offences that would make it unethical for society to expect a man and woman to remain living together. For these, a judicial separation gave legal sanction to their living apart, but still bound them in law, denying them both the freedom to remarry, but allowing the wife to claim lifelong alimony from her husband. The various bars from divorce also followed the religious doctrine that petitioners must come with clean hands, i.e., that they must have a real grievance against their spouse but not be immoral themselves. Frank particularly strongly objected on moral grounds to judicial separation. He considered it an illusory remedy, the worst ever presented as a settlement of matrimonial differences, wholly inapplicable to the nature of the offence, unknown by the Church of Christ except under the dominion of Rome. The whole concept that marriage was only dissolvable on the ground of adultery, he said, was based on dictum laid down in the New Testament and variously interpreted. He reasoned that the system needed a complete overhaul, and this is what he proposed. Out went the inequality. Judicial separation was to be scrapped, and all grounds for it henceforth to be grounds for a full divorce, extended to include a 3-year sentence of penal servitude or a diagnosis of incurable insanity. Bars from divorce would also be scrapped, and divorce by mutual consent introduced for couples who had lived apart for a year. It is difficult now, with our more liberal divorce laws, to appreciate just how radical Frank's suggestions were. At the time, the Lord Chancellor dismissed them out of hand as an outrage and an insult to their lordships personally. He foresaw by such a move the actual breakdown of the fabric of Edwardian society, but Frank's conviction was unshaken. His tenacity is demonstrated by the lengthy period over which he continued to campaign for this cause in speeches, in the founding of a society and his membership of others, and various publications on the subject, all advocating the reforms to which his rational thought had led him, but which would take another 70-odd years to become law. For this, Frank deserves to be considered a pioneer in the field. Undoubtedly, divorce reform was the major campaign of his life, but underpinning it was a long protest against religious dogma. Lay sermons was the first public expression of views he had been raised with and had further explored with Lionel Johnson in a correspondence that Frank published in 1919 under the title Some Winchester Letters of Lionel Johnson. It would be followed by numerous criticisms of the manner in which religion irrationally influenced public policy. During the House of Lords debate on the doomed 1906 Education Bill, for example, Frank asked what right the state had to insist upon a child attending religious instruction, and argued that the Church's insistence that it was in the child's best interests was precisely the principle by which religious pressure and religious persecution have been justified in all ages. People had a right to decide for themselves, he argued. This he revisited in 1922, deriding the sinister shadow of the Church which overhung educational policy in Britain and prevented Parliament producing a charter of education pure and simple with regard to vested interests. He advocated instead a shift in emphasis towards science, saying, all superstitions die hard, but for the progress of humanity, the scientific education of our young should be more thorough. He also resented the common misunderstanding that to be atheist was to be immoral. Conscience, he argued, and positive feedback from others were equally as good a guide to moral conduct. It is not only the religious who possess a conscience, he told the House during a debate concerning conscientious objectors. There is such a thing as a social conscience. And conversely, he argued that it is possible for a man to go through life without breaking any of the 10 Commandments and yet be a bad man and antisocial. Worse still, in his view, was the Church's expectation that its doctrine must be swallowed wholesale without being subject to intellectual scrutiny, with its sometimes very obvious harmful effects. Take this, for example, concerning religious objection to birth control. In John Bull, Frank wrote that a mother's health was often impaired by multiple pregnancies and her resultant children sickly if they survived at all, adding, I find it difficult to listen with patience to the suggestion that this result is in accordance with Christian religion. It is against humanity. It is against medical science and common sense. It is against the happiness and well-being of the race. And if indeed it be Christian, then Christianity itself is against these things. Such logic Frank also employed in other fields. For women's suffrage, in response to Lord Bryce's assertion in the House of Lords that women should not have the vote because they are different, he asked why differences needed to be brought into it at all. Why cannot the argument for women be based on the simplest and most straightforward reason, the reason that they are human beings? Not that they are a special class, not that they will be able to uplift our politics, but simply that they are human beings. And if the franchise is a weapon that they need for their self-defense and for the protection of their interests and of their labor, women need it just as much as men. Common humanity would also be the basis for his argument against conscription, which he described as a national dishonor and a deep disgrace. It is, or should be, repulsive to any man to order another man to fight for him, he wrote. Once conscription became a reality, common humanity was also the basis for his argument against the brutal treatment of COs. What then is our final assessment of Frank's labours in the vineyard? It is hardly possible to cover Frank's entire body of work in one paper. I am aware I have not even mentioned his ventures in the burgeoning world of motoring, but I hope I've given a flavour of what Frank was up to when not knee-deep in litigation himself. ESP Haynes expressed the hope, specifically in regard to divorce law reform, that whenever the cause is won, full justice will be done to Lord Russell as a pioneer in this movement, as indeed he was in several others. Unfortunately, history is not so good at remembering the requisite pioneers of causes who fought at a point in time when the struggle was decidedly uphill, and who perhaps were not active or did not live to see their campaigns come to fruition. For this reason, Frank's labours have often been overlooked by historians, not only in divorce reform, but in his many battles against social injustice. Frank never set out to be a worldly success. He clearly stated that. His only aspiration, it seems, was to be true to his principles, to be free to live his own life, to think his own thoughts, to go uncoerced so long as his actions did not harm others. This, he would have said, was a moral life, and morality he defined, very much along utilitarian lines, as the course of conduct which tends to the ultimate happiness of the individual and of society. It was this idea of freedom for every individual that brought him into the Fabian Society in 1912 and the Labour Party thereafter. To believe in a socialist ideal that included nationalisation of land and the means of production, and increased opportunities for personal betterment through reading and education. To use his inherited position to fight for the underdog, in the hopes of a society not of men and masters, but of brothers and sisters. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to know more about the life and work of Frank Russell, or about my work and other publications, please visit my website, www.ruthderham.com.